Hello and welcome to a Fistful of Movies this week. Dennis, when we last recorded, it was a month ago. Since then, we've had a new monarch, a new owner of Twitter, about 5 prime ministers over in England. So not much has changed in that time.
Yeah, the more things change, the more they say the same. Lucky it's
Yeah,
business as
now,
usual for us anyway.
exactly. Yeah. So the last movie we talked about was Maverick, and we often get into discussions about what movie to do next. And you came up with A Better Tomorrow, which is a movie I hadn't seen up until a few days ago, and a movie I presume that you've seen quite a long time ago. And I think that's quite an interesting point of discussion to get into in terms of what a movie can mean to somebody based on when they've seen it, what a movie can mean to somebody from the cultural time, and this one came out in 1986, I believe, and what a movie can mean to somebody watching it now. I think it's a very fascinating point of intersection regarding the different meanings what a movie can have. Now, why did you pick this movie, and when did you first come across it, and what does it mean to you? I know you're a big action fan and 80s fan in general, but obviously you hold it in very high value.
Actually, yeah, just to run back at a few points there. So it was my first time watching this properly, as far as I know, because, as we say, when we've watched so many action movies together and some blend into others, and like even a certain director, you'll know that you've seen bits and pieces. But for this, as far as I know, like, yeah, hand on heart, it's first time watching it. And
Right.
yeah, I've been a big John Woo fan for a long time, but this is one that, like, I've constantly seeing images of, and like, reimaginings of, and like we'll get into later, it's spawned sequels, reimaginings, remakes,
Yeah.
everything. So like up until that point, is I still haven't seen A Better Tomorrow compared to all of like his kind of later, more famous work, you could say.
Yeah, it's good that we don't have these discussions to do any prep for the show whatsoever, because I actually did know it was the first time you did watch it, but I do know that it's in your wheelhouse in terms of what you like in action movies and crime movies in general. So why don't you just set up what this movie is for our listeners?
Yeah, it's really the one that, like, John Woo, he's got a massive filmography. I mean, years before he ever moved to Hollywood, he relocated and he actually came back in the end. But he made a lot of stuff in Hong Kong. And I would say it's more in I mean, there was action, but it's kind of kung fu, comedy wheelhouse before A Better Tomorrow. A Better Tomorrow is kind of a turning point in his career in the sense that, it introduced a lot of two-handed gunplay, Mexican standoffs. I mean, we're going to count later how many times we say these words in this review. But anyway, a lot of like the things that came to be John Woo trademarks. This is the movie that was always on the map as being like, this is the beginning. And like I said, I've seen his following Hong Kong movies and most of the kind of the early American ones as well. But I'd never gotten around to watching Bear Tomorrow. So it's one of those, like, it's an albatross around your neck kind of thing. It's like, okay, I know all these images. I know this is like the one that put Chow Yun Fat on the map, but I still hadn't seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned his Hong Kong movies. I'm probably right in my guess that although I could be wrong, that the first John Woo movies we were introduced to, or at least certainly me, were the American movies. I just have a list here in front of me because my memory's bad, but movies like Face Off, Mission Impossible 2, A Paycheck, Hard Boiled, extreme guns and action, and of course his famous, I don't know if he invented it, he certainly pioneered it, but we can't talk about bullet time, slow-mo, without John Woo, because he's pretty much been ripped off to the core in that way. I doubt even the Matrix could exist without John Woo's technique. It was your first introduction of John Woo, the Western version? Because this is the first Chinese John Woo movie I've ever actually seen, to my embarrassment. But this is why we like doing these deep dives, and you can kind of see how his style transitions so well to the West, because it's almost like a fusion of Eastern and Western cultures and Eastern and West story arcs in a very Hollywood kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the same as yourself in terms of like the first ones I'd seen would have been, I guess, Hard Target, which is always on TV back in the day, Broken Arrow, Face Off. So you can see with Hard Target and Broken Arrow, it took him a while to find his feet in the States. And then Face Off, obviously, he got to do everything he wanted. And yeah, once he got away with a budget, so that's really kind of John Woo at full pace. And Better Tomorrow, yeah, it's really, again, it put him on the map in terms of like the budget was low key, we'll say, like not massive. There are like shootouts and stuff, but you could tell it's like modest, we'll say. And it was a huge hit in Hong Kong. So then, like the following movies are all the ones that I watched about his kind of, we'll say, his real heyday in the Hong Kong, like The Killer, Hard Boiled, and Bullet in the Head. The three of them are kind of the three big ones that follow Better Tomorrow. So I'd never been introduced to this franchise properly. There's a sequel and a prequel, I think, and then they remade it in Korea, and another. I can't even tell you where the last remake was from, but anyway, that's the kind of influence it had on Asian action cinema. You know that it's still going, and I mean, I'm sure I heard they were thinking of a TV pilot as well. I don't know if that was launched or might be launched, but again, it's just like 36, 37 years later, and it's still something that's kind of held in high regard. And again, a massive hit at the Hong Kong box office, and really just put John Woo on the map, and almost put him on the American map at that stage. It was so big in Hong Kong.
Yeah, apparently it's the remake of although how much it follows the remake, I don't know, but maybe our listeners can mention in the comments. Apparently it's the remake of a 1960s or 1970s movie in terms of plot. Now, Dennis, when I get a copy of movies legally, of course, I always do a brief look through them to see if the copy is okay. And I have to admit, when I just jumped around from scene to scene and just saw some of the things that would be alarming if I saw in a film now, like bad dubbing or like, ho, 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 hey, of course we do this. And kind of just like a few dodgy effects here and there. When I was just jumping to check if the copy was okay, I was cursing you for picking the movie initially in terms of what I thought the quality would be. When I watch old movies, I don't expect modern acting. I don't expect modern effects. So I am able to transport myself to 1986 expectations, if you will. I'm quite good at doing that in terms of effects, in terms of acting. I'm not so good at doing that in terms of plot, but when I started the movie, I found the opening stages a little bit wobbly in terms of me finding that equilibrium in terms of transitioning to a movie from the past that's close to 40 years old. But it hooked me at a certain point. The setup, you can see the nucleus for this kind of story in things like The Departed, in things like just modern gangster movies in terms of conflicts between a brother on one side of the law and a brother that's a criminal, and Chow Yun-fat, which I've been sleeping on Chow Yun-fat's career because I loved him in this movie. I don't think Tarantino has half his characters without this Chow Yun-fat. What do you think this movie has for modern audiences? And I presume you like the movie. What do you think the movie? Where did the movie work for you?
Yeah. To start off, I mean, we'll get into him more as well for sure. But Chow Yun-fat, it absolutely put him on the map because I think in this he's the third lead, if I'm not mistaken. And I've got a couple of friends in Hong Kong. Every now and again I ask them like, who's this? Who does this guy mean in Hong Kong? And they told me that like in terms of the cast, the main lead, we'll say, was well known at the time. The second lead was also known for being a singer as well as an actor. So Chow was definitely a guy who was like, okay, this is playing the sidekick. So this guy, like, I mean, we'll get into his character later. So for sure, his influence and like, I also like you mentioned the convergence. Let's say you can see what it influences and what it has been influenced by in terms of old westerns. Apparently, John was a massive fan of like American westerns. I mean, you could see it. Like Sergio Leone, I think he's a big Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid guy, and Sam Peckinpah. I mean, some would say a lot of the slow mo, you kind of see bits of Sam Peckinpah, like you say, the Wild Bunch, Cross of Iron, the shootouts, and it's got all of that for sure. And yeah, to go back on your point there as well about like sometimes when you watch let's say like a Hong Kong movie that's a bit older, and you see the kind of the stylized music, and you're comparing it to like 1980s music movies that we watch. Like, let's say if you watch something as slick as Beverly Hills Cop, which is an 80s movie, and then you come to Better Tomorrow and the budget's like, less than 1/10, and you're kind of comparing and saying, look at the kind of sound design and stuff on this, and it's not in the same. But then you're right, you just roll with it, because once it gets going, it kind of finds its feet fairly quickly. And I agree with you, the plot is a bit kind of strange to get going. You're trying to work out who is who to what.
Yeah.
Even though it's not a complicated plot, but it's just the setup of the characters is a bit kind of thrown together, and everybody knows everyone is walking around talking, and you're kind of, okay, it takes you a minute to definitely cycle up to the characters. You're right.
Yeah, and I think movies that it takes you a while to work out what's going on, it's almost working subconsciously, because when it does come together and when you do start filling in the gaps, the earlier scenes kind of build a foundation. And I'm going to butcher a few names, but T Lung plays Sung Se Ho. We'll just say Ho because that's what they call him. And we see him and Chow Yun Fat, his character Mark, which is got to be the most English name in a Hong Kong movie. Don't know if that's translation, and we see them going about their business. And it took me a while to figure out what type of criminals they are, but I think it was quite an interesting. And I looked at this afterwards, but they're not drug dealers; they're counterfeiters, and that's another thing why you're trying to figure out who's who to begin with, because you see them going into offices, you see them just with money and machines, and it took me a few minutes to realize they were even criminals. And the brother took me, because the brother, who is he now? Actually, I can't see his name here, but the guy who's the music,
Kit.
Kit, yeah, because he looks so uncop like. It took me a while to begin with, to even figure out that his character would go in that direction. And the first, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, the movie is trying to keep its shape. And then we get a classic. I mean, this happens in the first 20 minutes, so I don't feel this is a spoiler, but we get the movie starts with Ho and Mark on top of the world. I don't think they're the head boss, but they're pretty much the right-hand man of the boss. And there's a double crossing that occurs, and something goes wrong at some deal in Taiwan. And I won't go into what happens, but the movie takes a 3-year jump quite early in the movie, which changes the fortunes of Ho, changes the fortunes of Mark, and changes the fortunes of Kit, which I actually didn't expect to see coming. And it like we were saying, it explains why Kit is acting a certain way early on, like very childish, because the movie has that time jump in mind. So when he's kind of just joking around and punching his brother in a very childish way, it's to show him young. So when we get the 3-year time jump, it's to show him maturing. When we see Ho and Kit on top of the world and doing all these small by modern gangster standards, crime scenes, it's groundwork laying its way for that 3-year jump that really sets the motivation for his character, really sets the central conflict between the brothers, and it's from that point that the movie really went up in my estimation. However, we do have this fantastic sequence just before that I don't know where it is. Is it in a hairdresser? No, it's not in a hairdresser's, but he what is it? A massage place?
Some kind of like, let's say a black market operation where they they're having some sort of tea and dinner. Obviously bring in like lady friends and stuff. Anyway, let's just say it's like a kind of a gangster's mole sweatshop or whatever. But
and we get this sequence where Chow Yun Fat is doing this kind of dance and passionately kissing this woman in slow-mo down this corridor, and just the choreography of the scene is very good, actually, and probably ahead of its time. And you could see someone like Tarantino looking at that and being influenced, and he's just almost dancing with this girl, and he's putting these guns in these flower pots, and all hell breaks loose from that scene. And you mentioned Peck and Paw. That's definitely something out of like the Wild Bunch in terms of its conception. It was a brilliant scene, wasn't it?
Yeah, the slow mo, the death, and that just like instantly right there, you're at a John Woo trademark. And actually, that's one of the things I felt that apart from let's say Face Off, he tended to dial that back for America because
Mm,
at times you can see why it's a bit violent, but in a good way. It's kind of like
yeah.
nonstop bullet ballet stuff, and all the movies that follow have a bit of that, like The Killer, Hard Boiled. You know, they have those kind of bravura action sequences. He gets all these like two-handed gunplay, jumping up in slow mo, reshoots the shot. You know that like smashing the flower pots open, missed bullets and everything else. And yeah, you can just see right away Chow Yun Fat is like a star of like Asian action cinema for a reason. And yeah, he also followed John Woo over later, of course. But yeah, does that scene like sets the character alight and sets Chow Yun Fat like into the stars, and it's just a action classic scene. I mean, I'd seen reruns and bits of that before. I knew that
Mm.
that scene was in the movie. Oh, it just kind of unleashes and it just catches fire completely. Yeah, kicks the plot forward as well, like you said, just
Mm.
before the 3 year jump scene. So, like, yeah, everything about it is good, basically.
Yeah, did the movie take off from you for you as well after the 3 year plot jump? Because that's where things start getting really interesting. Why don't you talk us through what happens after that? A bit
I think so
what you
because
liked.
it just becomes more clear, you know. Mark, like you said, he has that shootout and he's walking back, and of course, like there. I mean, there are some moments where you could say there's bits of like action cliches that you can now spot, but maybe at the time they're not so evident. And then there's like one gangster dying, and he gets his gun and he manages to shoot Mark twice, I think, in one leg, and like
Yeah.
when you see him in the 3 year time jump, he's still working for the triads, but he's pretty much at like the lowest level. He's practically a bum, because he's got this bad limp after taking like two bullets in the leg. So he's obviously not a much. They assume he's not much use to them in terms of being like a kind of even a counterfeiter, bodyguard, or all the
Mm.
roles that he taken before. Like so things have gotten bad for him as well. Like they said after Ho gets out of prison, and for him, Ho is being watched by cops as well at the same time because they're saying, okay, we know you're mid-level triad counterfeiting, so they've made it clear that they're keeping an eye on him. And one of the cops was the one who was originally part of the setup, we'll say, who's one of the arresting officers in the
Mm.
setup, is also watching him. So Ho is kind of like being monitored, and he, in the meantime, goes to work for this guy in a garage who's kind of an ex-con and is running this whole thing, saying, "Okay, all the guys here are going to be straight now. They used to be convicts." So you can
Yeah.
see what his like motivation is to get clean, I guess, of the gangster life, and he's aware that his brother's a cop as well. And meanwhile, his brother, who was passed over for promotion because of being, related
Mm.
to Ho and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of character stuff moving, kind of cycling around. I missed
Yeah.
something there.
Yeah, and a lot of it forms kind of the modern character arc for crime and gangster movies, and I think that's where people will who come from maybe I don't know what do they call them, millennials, Gen Z, or people that are younger who will be watching something like this. That maybe I think you probably I could be wrong. I think you have to be a cinephile to an extent, or have a love of movies to go back and watch a movie like this. I don't. I think it's too kind of specific in its era for people who are just casually watching movies. But if you are somebody who likes your movies and is a cinephile, it actually holds up way better than I expected. The acting mightn't be the greatest, but again, that's Eastern style acting. It probably doesn't translate because sometimes it's just over the top and goofy, but that's how over the top emotion is portrayed sometimes. I mean, you see it in anime all the time, but in terms of character motivation and character arcs, even, which is unusual for an action movie, it has a little bit more depth than normal ones, and I think a lot of that's got to do with the time jump. And I was mentioning Chow Yun Fat earlier, and you said how he's considered a big action star. He was considered box office poison prior to this movie, apparently, and all his movies were a complete flop at the box office, and he wasn't even an action star. But the director saw something in him, and I think his performance is very contemporary in a way. Now I was watching this with my partner. Well, she wasn't particularly watching it, but she was kind of in and out, doing other stuff. And one stage, she just looked at Chow Yun Fat and was like, "This guy is like almost like a caricature of someone who's trying to be cool." And I think if you look at that in reverse, it's more like that this guy had so many cool traits, like the matchstick while smoking,
Shades, yeah.
the shades, which apparently sold out in Hong Kong after this movie, and I think Alan Dion or whatever his name is, he actually wrote him a thank you letter for boosting sales. But or the jacket, the trench
A
coat,
long coat, yeah.
It's more like this character influenced so many other cool traits, and I looked it up afterwards just to confirm that was the case. But he obviously, people like the man with no name had the match and that kind of gruff beforehand, and it didn't come from nowhere. But the inception of this character and having so many cool traits in one influenced so many different things, like in terms of what we expect from our action stars afterwards. And he's the real breakout star of this movie. And his acting, even when he's telling one scene about how he had to drink piss, which turned out to be a true story. So no wonder he could draw from that. That from another movie, the set of City on Fire, apparently that was a real story where he had to drink piss. But how he turns from this kind of laughing to almost remembering it and changing his face when you can see that he's actually traumatized. Or there's a scene later on where he's on his way away from a scene on a boat, and then you can just see this conflict in his character of whether he should return or not. He really sells every scene, doesn't he? From like the maniac action star to the conflict to the bomb, like you said, when he got shot in the leg. He's the true line and the thread in this movie from start to finish. That he's probably the one reason that anyone should watch this movie, because I think this guy comes down as one of like my favorite kind of breakout action star characters in any action movie I've seen, actually.
Yeah, I agree with you there. You know, like subsequently, I mean, we'll get into like what happens next in the series and everything later, I'm sure. But like he is the one used on the cover now. Obviously, he's the biggest star. I mean, outside of Hong Kong, like T Long and Leslie Chung, really, you know. So like Chow Yun Fat, obviously, Crouching Tiger and everything else, and like he has had hits in the States for sure and abroad. So like there's that side, but then it's also just that, like you said, the character is so good that like you can see why they put him on the cover, like with the guns and like the matchstick. So by the time that it comes that you actually get to watch it, or like, you know, say we watch it now, you're kind of surprised that he's not the star, but he should be. And like it feels like he should have more screen time, if anything. There's kind of, they show enough of him and his, like, you know, his past and the stuff he had to do and being a bum, like you said, that you kind of want to see more. And it definitely, like, he sells everything he has. He uses up every moment. Like, he really strides through the action scenes as well. And the brothers, their conflict, I guess, is more straightforward in a sense, like, you know, like you said, you mentioned The Departed and stuff. And again, if you watch this retrospectively, you're used to those arcs of like the good guy, bad guy, cop, kind of criminal. You know, there's a lot of that in here too, I guess. But yeah, Chow Yun Fat is like amazing in it basically, and you can see why they kind of that kickstarted a, you know, filmmaking kind of franchise, I guess, with like in terms of Wu and Chow Yun Fat in the Scorsese De Niro sense, because he's in The Killer as well, and Hard Boiled and a couple of others. I think Once a Thief, which I haven't seen, but like that's apparently more towards comedy. But Hard Boiled and The Killer, yeah, just cut from the same cloth. I mean, obviously, Wu saw like his performance, and this is just like this. I'm just going to keep using this guy because he's like, you know, diamond carrot level. Yeah.
Yeah, I do feel like going on a Chow Yun Fat binge, actually, because I and like these stars who transition to other countries, you kind of just often get almost like a one note transition of what they were famous for, especially back then in the 90s. I remember what was that movie? Was it with the guy from American Pie, Stifler, who's not a bad comedy actor, but
Oh
what
yeah.
Bulletproof Monk was it?
Yeah, yeah.
Like
Best forgotten for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
well, these were my experiences with Chow Yun Fat growing up, and obviously maybe Crouching Tiger, but it's not exactly an action movie in the traditional sense. It's more of a period piece and a bit of fantasy. But I do feel like going on a bit of a binge of these movies at the moment after this, because one of the things I like about these retrospectives is you kind of discover someone who's been right under your nose all your life, and you kind of got them at the latter end of the career where, like, could you imagine somebody who has watched De Niro or to a lesser extent Pacino for the last
Starting with Meet the Parents and analyze this.
I mean, I like Meet the Parents, but that's where it
Yeah,
started going wrong because De Niro thought he was
comedy.
a
Yeah.
comedy star. But could you imagine? But could you imagine somebody who's been alive for the last 25 years and grew up on latter day De Niro and coming across something like Taxi Driver or Raging Bull? I'm not saying it's on the same level by any means, but it does give you the same effect where we just kind of look and you're like, this guy was doing that stuff like before
Yeah,
they phone it in,
he tried like his just like John Woo. It took him a few movies. I mean, I can't think of it something really great that Chow Yun Fat's made outside of Hong Kong. To be honest, I mean, there's been like a few okay ones. He was in one of the pirate sequels, and you can tell that's like purely for money. I mean, that's probably the biggest movie he's ever been in, like one of the pirate sequels. And then I think he had two shoot 'em up kind of like late 90s action
Mm.
movies, which like you said exactly, they're Diet Coke versions of the Hong Kong star that he is. It was like The Replacement Killers was one, and the other one I think it's what is it, corrupt the corruptor. Yeah, that's with Mark Wahlberg. So like there was two, and they're fine, you watch them but you completely forget them. But like compared to Hard Boiled, The Killer, or Better Tomorrow, not on the same like wavelength at all. It's just very much like Diet Coke style action, just
Mm.
flashier editing, more MTV style. Yeah. So again, yeah, he
So
hasn't hit it fully in the States, I would say, even not as much as John Woo, who at least had Face Off, right? So
yeah, so you would recommend Hard Boiled and The Killer if that's what it's called? Because I actually haven't seen any of those movies either, but I just feel like kind of it's a cold winter over here at the moment. I feel like just having a kind of cozy 80s and 90s action kind of binge sometime
oh
in
yeah, definitely. And
the
like you
next
said,
week or
once
two.
once you get into the whole like the 80s editing, the Hong Kong, like you said, delivery sometimes, which is can be over the top.
Yeah.
But like it doesn't matter because the movies themselves are good. And then like you've got the action scenes on top of that, which like they are good. They're incredible in a Better Tomorrow at times, like the boat shootout and like Chow Yun Fat shootout in the tea shop house, we'll call it. And but
Yeah.
like compared to those, like The Killer and Hard Boiled are on the next level again, we'll say, like, in terms of
Right.
the editing. And I guess like once John Woo had made this, and then he made the prequel sequel as well, which obviously we haven't seen. But so obviously he was used to working with Chow and used to the bullet time or whatever you want to call it,
Mm.
his slow-mo like action movie, which he kind of prevented like from ever getting stale when he was in Hong Kong as well. So that was great.
Yeah, well, we'll get into a bit of spoilers now about the latter half of the movie, but I'm going to presume you've, and I'm not going to. Hopefully, I won't spoil this for you, even though if it's spoilers. But have you done your research on A Better Tomorrow 2 and 3? Because I was shocked there was I was shocked there was sequels. So I was even more shocked that Chow Yun Fat is actually in them. Do you know the story behind it? It's quite funny. Like
Yeah, it's like they just wanted to bring him back no matter the
yeah,
cost, basically. And they said, like, okay, well, what can we do? He very clearly gets shot a lot of times. And
yeah,
so like they invented the brother character. I mean, like you said, yeah, we
yeah,
haven't watched it, but you can tell, like, how do we replicate this hit? And it's like, okay, we
yeah.
need to bring back the guy who pretty much made it the hit, like.
Bring back the twin brother. But yeah, but we mentioned that. But getting into the latter scenes of the movie now, I can't remember what exactly they take, but it's the MacGuffin anyway. It's basically a computer disc with with something that can bring down the head boss, which the very fashionable Chinese mob bosses again with the iconography of the white jackets and the scarves. Like in any other culture, it could be considered camp, but the way these triads pull this off is with a certain sense of like intimidation. I haven't
Yeah,
been
it's
able to figure out why because it's very France Fashion Week, isn't it?
yeah, it's a big money thing as well to be able to flash it, like, and they have no qualms about it.
Mm.
But yeah, like you said, I guess the cops are closing in at the same time, and the triads are trying to kill Ho, and Mark is like, on the fringes, about to like get back to his best work in terms of like being a friend bodyguard thing, and then they go to his garage where Ho works, with all the ex-cons, and like they're threatening him. And
Yeah.
Mark, like you said, he's a terrible trajectory in terms of the things that happens to him. I mean, like, becomes a bum after being shot twice in the leg and then gets beaten up by all these guys. And it's a heavy fucking beating too. Like they're really
Yeah,
knocking the shit out of him on top of like a rooftop, and yeah, he just barely kind of limps back to the garage, and then he ends up breaking up the fight. His beating is so bad, like between the other triads and the ex-cons, and then that kind of all sets up, like you said, the floppy disk or whatever they have to get from the triad guy, who is like the son of the original boss, who ends up being the guy who originally framed or like set up Ho
yeah,
in Taiwan. So that at least that's good. Like, it's a kind of a full circle moment for him that he's going to be the big bad
yeah.
in the shootout. Yeah.
Yeah, because he was the right hand man, wasn't he, at the in the early stages? But I actually really did like the shootout at the end as well. And I don't know what the body count was, but again, we mentioned Chow Yun Fat acting early on and his character, but considering the setup is him going away on the boat, deciding to turn around, and then cleaning house with some, I think it was submachine Uzis, but he's just shooting all around him and taking out the whole bad guys. Like just before a tense kind of. I think Kit was kidnapped at that stage. Like it's a bit silly, but it adds to the action, and we get this trade off between the big bad boss and Kit. There's just an excuse for havoc, basically, and I don't want to have too many gripes, but this is a classic action movie thing that gripes me, where the guy who's Mark, in this case, Chow Yun Fat, he's able to kill everybody, but then he just like takes his eye off the ball and then gets shot. Like that continuously happens. I guess it's an action movie, but I feel like they need to frame the sudden shot from out of nowhere a bit better, because like that trope drives me mad, because it's always the guy who's like slick as can be, and then he ended up getting absolutely hammered,
Oh yeah,
which
he's
I
like
get.
the boss and his henchmen, like I can't remember the boss's name, but they're just like machine gunning him to death, like he's
Yeah,
spinning around and everything. It's almost like
yeah.
over the top. Just in case this guy is definitely dead, like and
Yeah, he's definitely dead. And yeah, we even get a Will I Am, is that what's called, a Willem scream at that stage as well, and we get a nice kind of, I don't want to call it a Dirty Harry moment, but there's an end to one Dirty Harry movie where he throws his badge in the river or something like that, because he's lost his faith in the law. Well, we get a scene later on where Kit just hands a gun to his brother in order to just shoot the big bad, who at this stage is like, listen, I'll be out in a few minutes with my
yeah,
money, and that was a nice moment.
yeah, the gloat as well. Yeah, again, like there are cliches here, but they're used well. I think like when you can reinforce it and back it up with
Yeah,
other good stuff, then it's all right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is like if you watch so many action movies, you know what's coming. But then again, like this has influenced so many action movies. I think it's earned its place for that. And like you said, coming back to it like 37, 38 years, whatever, after it's been made, that it does hold up. Again, you do have to have an in at least like retroactively checking out action movies that kind of influence a lot of things. You can't just expect Black Panther 2 level productions or Avatar 2 effects, that kind of thing. Like it won't satisfy
no,
those people. It will not. But like that's probably the point. Like that's why it's refreshing to check it out, right? Yeah.
yeah, and I would definitely recommend our listeners check it out. Right, Dennis, thanks very much for that talk about Better Tomorrow. Maybe we'll revisit some other Hong Kong movies in the future, if depending on listener feedback, and I'm going to check out some anyway myself, so we'll see what happens. All right, that's it for now. Good luck and goodbye. Thanks, Dennis.
Thanks.